She slept peacefully, safe at home, with no idea she was being filmed, that a disturbed person was watching her body. The house was like a macabre big brother designed by someone unsuspected, someone who lived in disguise, barely noticed. But in reality, it was a sick and incurable person whose twisted fantasies put an end to dreams and lives. I'm Marcos Campos. Welcome everyone. Here, every week we have 3 new episodes, so if you like to hear real stories about crimes and mysteries, I invite you to subscribe and follow the channel. Enable the notification bell, it's important. At least we think the platform will deliver the video as soon as it's published. Turning on the bell already increases the likelihood of it happening. But what also strengthens our bond is your interest. So, if you like our productions, leave a comment. Even if it's just an emoji, just to show the algorithm that you're interacting with the content, you're like. That way, the platform understands more and more that you like our productions, our videos, episodes, and delivers them as soon as we post, okay? Another very important thing that helps us is for you to join our members club, but if you can't right now, that's okay. Just leave a comment or like, that helps a lot. One thing I'm going to ask you guys from the bottom of my heart, if you like my work here, share a video, send it on social media in groups, because that will help us reach more people. There comes a moment on the platform. The channel seems to hit a plateau, you know? I look here, the channel statistics are, we have 2 metrics, okay? In the channel's analytics here. There's recurring audience, meaning people who always come back to watch the videos, and new audience. This graph, it's harsh, you know? The recurring audience is up here, and the new audience is often at 0. It means the platform isn't showing our content to new people, so we end up stuck there, you know? And it's bad, right? For those who create content, we need to reach more and more people so we can keep making great episodes for you. Okay, so I'm counting on your help. Share it, alright? That's it? Message received. Let's discuss the facts. Well, the main character of today's episode is Mengmei Leng, a Chinese woman who was born on January 29, 1991 in Xinjiang province, China. And Mengmei was known for being an extremely calm and kind person. And here, I'll already share a personal detail with you. Mengmei Leng moved to Australia to try to fulfill her dream of studying, right? To have an international education. So, she began being called Michelle. I didn't find any sources that explain why she started being called Michelle. Sources? From my own thoughts, I presume that maybe it's because of, maybe for convenience, right? Calling her Michelle in Australia is just my own thought. But since she was called Michelle there, we'll call her Michelle from now on. Agreed. That's it, very well. In 2008, bad things had already started happening in Michelle's life. An earthquake struck China in her birth province where she lived, resulting in her father's death. This major natural disaster in China claimed over 87,000 lives. Out of everyone, 5,000 were children, right? This impacted both people who disappeared and those whose deaths were confirmed. And among those victims was Michelle's father. But despite this misfortune, Michelle remained focused on her studies. She got a lot of help from her mother, who was a strong woman and supported her through all the adversity, right? That life put in their path. Michelle stayed focused and worked hard to achieve her childhood dream of moving to Australia. And it was in 2011 that she managed to achieve this dream. She got a lot of high grades in school and she managed to get admitted to the University of Technology, Sydney. And it was from that moment that she was able to put it into practice, right? Take the first step to make her dream come true. Michelle then moved to Australia and went to live at her aunt's house, her mother's sister. This aunt had already been living there for some time in Australia. She was already, how can I say, well accustomed to the Australian country. She already had a family. She lived with her 2 children, and that's how Michelle joined this family. So she started living with her aunt and 2 cousins, and life was going very well. Everything was going as expected. Michelle is really happy keeping in touch with her mother who ended up staying in China. Her aunt there is a really nice person. Her cousins, right? The photos show they got along well and were a happy family. Until in 2012, Michelle's aunt, who was already 44 years old, met a guy and married him. This guy's name was Derek Barrett, a guy who was 20 years younger than Michelle's aunt. And therefore, he was almost in the same age group as Michelle. He was about 3 years older just than Michelle. This Derek was an information technology professional, but he was unemployed at the time he married Michelle's aunt. And he was described as a quiet guy, you know? People didn't see much expressiveness. He was a really laid-back guy. How he won over Michelle's aunt, I don't know. Even more so being unemployed at that point in his life, being 20 years younger than the woman. Anyway, whatever the case, they got married and now Derek became part of this family. So, in that house now lived Michelle's aunt Michelle, her 2 cousins, children of that aunt, and Derek Barrett. Yeah, I know, you guys are pretty close, right? You're already connecting all the dots, putting them up there on our little semantic board. This connects to that, then to that. I get it. Let's see what happens. Well, it's reported that at this point in the marriage, when Derek started living with the family, nothing unusual was happening, right? So the family was living normally. Michelle was studying at the university, right? She worked hard to become a great professional and took a part-time job. Everything seemed to be going well, right? She got along really well with everyone. But at that point in their lives, about 2 or 3 years after the wedding, Michelle's aunt got a job where she needed to spend a lot of her time away from home. It was a job where she needed to travel and attend business meetings. They lived in a suburb of Kempsey near Sydney. And Michelle's aunt always needed to travel to a nearby city, but it was about 80 kilometers away. Many times she needed to spend days there, even though it was close. She had to stay there with many meetings until late hours of the day, right? So she had to be there, in that place. So now, they're in that small apartment in Kempsey. It was Derek, Michelle, and Derek's 2 stepchildren, Michelle's cousins, living there. Right, they've started calling again and connected another thread on the board, haven't they? Is everything okay? In April 2016 specifically, Michelle's aunt had to travel again for work. Everything was arranged, scheduled for her to return on the 24th December of April. She was going to travel. She would be away from home for those days, and had already arranged with Derek that on the 24th he needed to pick her up at the station where she would arrive. Let's say an opportunity opened up there. Remember our triad: means, motives, and opportunities. Well, at that moment, an opportunity opened up, didn't it? 3 days before Michelle's aunt was to return, on April 21st, Michelle, who was already 25 years old at that time, was hanging out with some friends, just having a good time, and she planned to go back home at noon. So she took a bus from the University of Technology, Sydney. But before going home, she stopped by a mall in the city. There are some photos, right? From the cameras that caught Michelle shopping at Pitt Street Mall, which is in a shopping center there in Sydney. A very busy center, actually a financial district, one of the busiest in the city. Michelle was at that place around 3 p.m., so she was seen walking around inside that mall doing some shopping. Anyway, she seemed normal. There was nothing to show that she was upset, bothered by something, or in a hurry. She was just walking around normally. About an hour and a half later, she was caught again by surveillance cameras. She was taking a train at St. James Railway Station, which is a very busy train station also in Sydney. It was about 4:30 post-meridian. And it was exactly at that moment that Michelle was seen for the last time, alive and without suffering. Yeah, folks, that was the moment she was captured for the last time, alive actually, right? And without being in a state of suffering, and I'll explain to you why that is in a moment. Even though she was captured then, that was the last time she was alive, right? Still on that day, she talked to some friends by cell phone message, and those friends who were later interviewed said there was nothing alarming. Michelle was completely normal, just like she always was. So the days went by, and the day of Michelle's aunt's return arrived. Remember that she was traveling, right? She had arranged with her husband to pick her up at the station on the 24th, and the 24th arrived. So Derek went, as agreed, to the train station. She got off. They talked about trivial things there, and she ended up asking, "Where is Michelle?" Derek answered at that moment. It had already been 2 days since he last saw Michelle when Derek was asked why, right? Where was Michelle? Had she talked to him? He was unemployed again. At that time in his life, he said he was on the computer, spent a lot of time on the computer, stayed up all night on the computer, God knows doing what. He told Michelle's aunt that nothing was wrong, he saw nothing, and that was it. 2 days had passed since he noticed Michelle was home. At that point, this was our situation. It had already been 2 days since Michelle had shown any sign of life, and Derek himself said he hadn't seen her at home for 2 days. Mall security footage after the train station showed Michelle at 4:30 post Meridian 2 days earlier. So, no one else contacted her, and with her phone off, calls went straight to voicemail, correct? To voicemail. That was very unusual because Michelle always kept in touch with people, especially with the family members who stayed in China. Her mother and everyone else were already worried since she wasn't showing any signs of life, and Derek too, right? He didn't say anything, his wife didn't say anything, supposedly no one was hanging around his house, right? On the computer, he didn't see that the girl had been missing for 2 days because he would be the key person there to give the news, right? Tried to inform the family, but the guy shrugged and no one knew anything. Oh, and another important point in all this is that it had also been 2 or 3 days since Michelle had used her social media. No posts or stories, nothing. When they got home, her aunt looked around the house. Michelle's room was tidy like this, right? It seemed like she had just stepped out and would return soon, but as we saw, she never did. Another important detail that even Michelle's aunt will remember later is that the house was very tidy. Everything was in perfect order in its proper place. Anyway, keep that information in mind. Well, already quite worried, Michelle's aunt took her husband there, and they went to the police station to report that there was a missing person. To file a police report about Michelle being missing, they were interviewed at the police station. The aunt said she had just gotten back from a business trip, right? She had the whole story backed up. She really wasn't home when Michelle disappeared, and Derek told what he had already told. But to Michelle's aunt, he said he was on the computer and hadn't seen Michelle for 2 days. But what nobody knew was that while that police report was being filed at the station, Michelle was already dead because her body had been found. Michelle's body was found at 10:30 a.m. on a Sunday, specifically April 24th, which was the day her aunt was coming back from her trip. The body was found because several people started contacting the police, reporting that there was a body floating face down in a river at the Snapper Point Lookout. Correction, Michelle's body was not dumped in a river or creek. Okay, I messed up with the script correction here. Now, I went to look at the photos of where her body was found. It's a coastal area, okay? Like a gorge in the middle of the ocean with extremely tall rocks. That's why it's called the Lookout Point, right? It's a tough place to reach, especially since a helicopter had to handle the rescue. I was just talking nonsense. This thing about Rio Riacho has nothing to do with it. It's out in the ocean, right? It's really a hard to reach area. The body was tied up with ropes, and during that initial forensic examination, several deep wounds were found. In fact, the body had to be removed from the water with the help of a helicopter because it was in a hard-to-reach place. It had drifted down the river and was removed, catching everyone's attention. And initially, it's a fact that the woman wasn't identified, but it was reported that she was an Asian person, around 20 to 30 years old, measuring 1.70 meters tall, more or less. Well, even though the identification wasn't officially made there, with that description, it didn't take long, right, for them to connect the dots. And soon it was confirmed that it really was the body of Michelle Leng. Well, the family was notified then, and that was the news. A very painful blow, especially for Michelle's mother, who was in China, right? She was thrilled her daughter achieved her dream of moving to Australia to pursue her career and start an international studio. She worked hard to make it possible for her daughter to go there. Imagine the weight of that. Maybe her conscience was feeling guilty about that, wasn't it? Because all the effort she made to send her daughter, and now her daughter ends up in a tragic way. Mutilated, stabbed body found floating in river. It was terrible news. In fact, Michelle's grandmother passed away a few days after the body was discovered, right? After the news spread. It was literally, guys, that kind of death from sadness, you know? She died of sadness. According to the initial report, that body that was found had injuries caused by a knife of about 40 centimeters. Anyway, the evidence showed that it had been a very brutal murder without any mercy. It's described that there was such a deep cut on the throat that, the throat was almost completely separated from the body. But in the middle of all this bomb exploding in the family's lap, fortunately, the Australian police didn't take long to solve the case because the killer, any guesses about who the killer is? Was there a personal confession? That's right, the killer confessed to everything he did. And this confession happened during the trial, after the inquiry, after the investigations. It was at the trial that the confession took place. The courtroom, the mood was tense, wasn't it? Many people were crying, sighing, that atmosphere, really heavy. Michelle's mother, right? She was there in tears, listening to the whole confession of that man who detailed everything he had done to her daughter. Without any shame, he reached that point right there. During the trial, Michelle's mother even begged the judge to sentence that man to life in prison. Do you know whose trial that was? You guessed it if you said Derek Barrett. That's right, he was Michelle Lange's killer. The uncle, her aunt's husband, right? The quiet guy who went unnoticed by everyone. He was the monster living inside the house, in the supposed safety of home. There was a sick mind there. I'm going to tell you all the details of everything that happened, okay, guys? I got ahead of myself with the order, right? Jumping to how the confession happened in court. Let me give you the details. Details of how this guy confessed everything that happened on the day of Michelle's murder. This Derek was a complete sick pervert who developed an irreversible obsession in his mind. There with Michelle, he started living with his aunt, who was 20 years older than him. Inside the house were two young women, Michelle, his cousin. And this man developed an obsession with Michelle and also with his own stepdaughter. From that moment on, he created, as I mentioned in the introduction of the episode, a sinister, macabre big brother. Inside the house, he began installing hidden cameras in the bathroom and bedroom. Anyway, he really created an atmosphere there, like Big Brother, but in this case, it's a sick version of it, to satisfy himself. And as I said, Derek was a quiet guy, He spent most of his time alone in the house. So nobody there had any suspicion that he was a disturbed person, right? With serious mental problems, a completely deformed brain, he went unnoticed there on his computer. So, when he said that Michelle disappeared for 2 days, he was on the computer. Was he, analyzing everything he had captured in his sick big brother? Although he was quiet and kept to himself, he also acted as the good guy, okay? He was a caring uncle, He treated his stepchildren like a nice guy, was always there by their side, answering when asked, saying kind things. Anyway, a completely camouflaged guy, everyone living there under the same roof. He went completely unnoticed by everyone. And during all this camouflage, as I said, he had the cameras there. He stored a lot of footage on his computer, and then he would watch it at night in the early morning when everyone was sleeping. His wife was usually traveling, right? She traveled for work to support the bum since he wouldn't get a job. And there he would stay at night, satisfying himself. If you know what I mean, I can't really say it out loud. With the footage he captured of Michelle, of her being vulnerable, his stepdaughter taking a shower, there were even reports and footage about that, because he also put cameras in their room. Cameras. He would put these cameras, micro cameras like that, the kind that are really for spying, hidden among beauty and hygiene products in the bathroom, right? Inside the bedroom, also hidden in some strategic spot. And those very cameras he set up caught him inside Michelle's room, touching himself and watching her while she slept in the supposed safety of her home. Imagine how horrifying that scene was. A guy there, I don't know, some disgusting person, a ghost, standing in the dark of the room, touching himself, watching Michelle as she slept. and she had no idea that this was happening until the time for the trip came. That trip of Michelle's aunt was probably the biggest window of time, right? Of all her work trips, this one may have lasted the longest. The guy had 4 days to plan everything. More than 4 days, right? He had plenty of time there to put this plan into action. So, probably since he was alone with the girls at home, whatever he had inside, it went overboard, right? He thought he could do it there, put his desire into practice, something he had been ruminating on internally for a while. Until that day when Michelle came back home where she was filmed at the mall. After that, she didn't get in touch with anyone else. From that moment, she was held captive by that sick man who made small talk. He said he hadn't seen Michelle for 2 days and all that, but he was already torturing Michelle, abusing her during those 2 days. In the end, he killed her, likely in the early hours of the 24th, and then disposed of the body. And the autopsy results showed that Michelle had more than 30 stab wounds on her body. In other words, she had been severely tortured. Besides those stab wounds, there were defensive injuries on her body, showing that she really fought for her life, but she didn't stand a chance. Looking at the photos, you can see she was a delicate person with a delicate body. And the guy was a brute, a man who must have done what he did to Michelle very easily for him. But I'll tell you, before we go on, a little bit about how the suspicions fell on this guy's shoulders. During the investigation, the police right away didn't believe Derek's story. They already know that thing, that professional instinct. Those guys have a knack for spotting a liar. He was skilled at remaining unnoticed in his own home. But maybe he wasn't as good when facing an investigator with accuracy, with a sharp eye, and already quite experienced in the job. So, when he started telling that little story about not having seen her for 2 days and all that, he was on the computer and didn't notice until his wife returned from her trip. That had already caught the police and investigators' attention. He said that on April 21st they had dinner together, Michelle and him. Afterwards, they watched a movie, and when the movie ended, each went to their own room and slept. And when he woke up the next day, Derek said that Michelle was no longer at home. Since then, he hadn't seen or contacted her. But when the authorities started to pressure him just to ask more specific questions, you know, guys, interview technique, the police started to go around. Ask a question here, another question over there, to see if he would contradict himself. And he started to get very defensive when he realized that the police were trying to corner him. So in this defensive posture, he started calling for his lawyer. Well, from that point on, he became the main target of the police. And from that moment on, he actually became the main suspect in the case. Everything was focused on him. And from that moment on, the case against him started to be built. Then, the police began investigating, as usually happens now. Cell phone signal. And wouldn't you know it, the guy's cell phone signal matched. The triangulation of the signal matched exactly with the place where Michelle's body was found. Another pretty strong piece of evidence, I would say, is that cameras caught the guy's car, a car similar to Derek's car. Right, guys, leaving that sniper point where the body was found at that lookout point around 7 a.m. on Sunday, April 24th. In other words, cell phone signal triangulation showed that he was there. Then a camera caught his car leaving there at 7 a.m., which proves what I told you, that the crime was probably finished in the early morning of the 24th, but it was already happening. Since that day when Michelle was last seen at 4:30 p.m. there at the train station. But of course, even though all this evidence was coming up, Derek kept insisting, right? His version that he really hadn't seen Michelle, that he was innocent, blah blah. Another piece of evidence emerged showing he actually committed the brutal crime. In the early hours of the 24th, he was also caught on surveillance cameras buying drinks and putting gas in his car at a gas station. And this gas station was on the way to that lookout point there at Snapper Point. When he was confronted with all this evidence, I mean, how is the guy gonna refute that, right? You can't argue with facts. And he started claiming that he suffered from memory loss because he used a lot of drugs. You know, he started making up another fantasy in his head, trying to get away with it, right? But guys, now comes the part that proves everything that happened, including what I mentioned earlier. So for you all about the images and everything else, right? While all the evidence was being analyzed, the police took Derek's cell phone, which was obviously confiscated there for the investigation. after he became the main suspect, and from there, a disturbing scenario of everything that happened comes to light. All those images from Big Brother, especially of Derek, were stored on his cell phone, as well as on the phone's memory card. And it was there that the police saw all those disturbing images of the girls taking a shower in Derek's bathroom, touching themselves in the bedroom, watching Michelle sleep. And because of all those images, the police saw that he was completely sick and that he wasn't just obsessed. Not only with Michelle, but also with his stepdaughter, but he found the opportunity to do that with Michelle. And it's very likely that if he managed to get away with this crime for some reason, he would probably continue his horrifying acts. The next victim would likely be his stepdaughter, Michelle's cousin, the wife's daughter. On that cell phone, the recordings of Michelle's last minutes of life were also stored. And with all that in hand, that's it now. The case against him, right, was completely built, and he would go to trial and would certainly be convicted. So, in 2017, with all of this in hand, Derek was indicted on 27 charges. Well, guys, let me tell you about the timeline of the crime. But before that, I wanted to share a thought that crossed my mind, something I keep imagining too. Right? Just like Michelle's mother must have been blaming herself a lot, for having made this dream of hers come true. Michelle must have blamed herself a lot too, right? For bringing him into her home, marrying him, actually making it possible. I'm just saying that must have caused her terrible internal guilt, right? Putting herself in that position, right, as a huge burden on her mind. For having created the environment so that this monster could put his delusions into practice, right? His mental deformity. But of course, all the blame is on the guy, right? I thought it must have been really difficult for these women, right? They must have really felt guilty for everything that happened. Well then, talking about the chronology of events. Michelle got home around 5, a little after 5 on the 21st, which means right after she was last seen on the station cameras. It was around midnight when she sent a final text message. From that moment on, she had no contact with anyone else. The police assumed that this was the moment when the torture began, and that Michelle's life changed from that point on. Derek enters the room and starts putting his delusions into practice. He ties Michelle up, puts a gag in her mouth, and tapes her so she can't scream or anything like that. This was proven by footage from the very camera Derek had hidden in the room, the final photographic record he made. It was around 8 o'clock in the morning on April 22nd. And at that time, Michelle still didn't have any fatal injuries. She was still tied up, gagged, and it was clear that she was trembling with fear, talking to him. And it was on that day, on the 22nd, that the stepdaughter came back home. Only Derek and Michelle were home, okay? Around 4 p.m., the stepdaughter entered the house but didn't notice or hear anything. She did the things she needed to do at home and then she left again, and she was obviously questioned by the investigators. She said she was home for about 3 hours that day and didn't hear anything. She also didn't notice her cousin wasn't there, which shows that probably the routine of the house was just like that. That way, right? They were adults and free to come and go as they pleased, weren't they? She likely went in, handled her task, noticed nothing, and returned to her routine. Michelle's cousin said that when she was home, she didn't see Derek. She said she was in the bathroom and he stayed in the bathroom the whole time she was at home. Why didn't that catch her attention? We don't know, but she said he stayed in the bathroom. She didn't see what he did, he left, and she heard no noise from Michelle. The monster's stepdaughter left the house, so he left the bathroom, returned to the bedroom, and resumed abusing. Michelle, do everything you can. Honestly, I don't think any normal person can imagine that, right? But can you try to imagine the amount of suffering that girl went through at the hands of that guy? So he went back to the room and the camera stopped recording footage. But the audio kept recording, where you could hear Michelle begging for her life, asking him why he was doing that. The footage continued until Michelle's final moments. Then, on April 23rd, surveillance cameras around the house filmed Derek leaving the trace at the scene. No, no. No, 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 no. No, no. No, no, no. On the day Michelle disappeared, he probably had some time there until he was seen as the main suspect. To erase everything he produced, but no, he kept it because he was sure he would get away with it and wanted to use it for the rest of his life. Look, it's incurable, like I said in the introduction. Well, getting back to the timeline then, it was at 3:19 in the morning on the 24th that Derek, with Michelle's body, he drove to Sniper Point and was caught there at the gas station. He drove there and left her body tied up. Did he dump it in the stream or the river? Where? He was found the next day at 10:30 antemeridium by several people who called the police. Well, folks, that's the timeline of events. And now I'm going to tell you about the trial of this guy. The trial began in October 2017. Derek, practically throughout the entire trial, didn't show any emotion. He stayed just the way he was described, the way people saw as normal, which was so typical of him. The only thing he did when he was heard was say that he suffered bullying at school, that he had problems with drugs and everything else. But he had already been through that by the hand of a psychiatrist who made a report claiming that he was fully capable of facing that trial. They couldn't. That basic cliche of saying he was crazy, alright then. During the entire trial process, there was a moment when Derek wrote a letter apologizing to his wife and also to Michelle's other family members. In that letter, you know that kind of personal half apology letter we've seen many times in other criminal cases? He says he has no words to express what he did, that he deeply regrets it, that nothing he says can lessen the family's pain. But when he really needed to speak, to verbalize the apology, he was a guy who froze up, you know? A guy who was annoying when it came to emotions. The mother, as I told you, has she already spoken at the trial? Obviously there was a translation there. And the only thing she asked the judge was to convict that malicious torturer, that rapist, that guy, without any kind of remorse. Life imprisonment, that was the plea from Michelle's family. And you know that story I told you? They must feel, right? Both the mother and the aunt. Slightly feeling guilty for having somehow made it possible for that to happen. The mother lets that slip in a way. She says that Michelle's death caused a lot of suffering in the family, mainly because she raised her daughter alone after her husband's death. During that natural disaster in China, she did all she could for her daughter to study in Australia. And anyway, guys, this woman is going to need a lot of psychological help to understand that, of course, it's not her fault nor her aunt's. They're just as innocent as Michelle. Because after all, the guy was a deceptive monster, persuasive. He had that quiet demeanor that maybe won people over. It's easier that way, right? So it's completely his fault. These women aren't involved, though they still carry the burden in their hearts. They're not to blame. And certainly good professionals like psychologists will be able to ease the pain in their hearts. It was Michelle's mother, also during the trial, who said that Michelle's grandmother fell into deep sadness. Days after the murder, she passed away. The bottom line of the personal trial is that Derek Barrett ended up pleading guilty, really, during the trial, right? He says he did nothing despite investigations. After I presented all the evidence at trial, he had no choice and pleaded guilty. And I don't even know if it was because of his guilty plea that the sentence ended up being reduced a bit, because he was convicted. And I mean just because it truly is, right? To 46 years in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 34 years and 6 months. So, very little, right? For the suffering he caused Michelle to her family, what he did to this girl in these almost 3 days, right? From the night of the 21st until the early morning of the 24th, when he ended up killing her in that cruel way with multiple stab wounds, right? Not to mention all the psychological and physical suffering he caused while he kept the girl tied up and gagged in that room. As if she were an object to him. A doll, right? Just to satisfy his sick desire. That he had been, growing in his mind for so long with the use of those cameras. The sentence was too light for someone as perverted and incurable as that guy. I'm not a professional psychiatrist or psychologist, but to me, a guy like that is incurable. Let's suppose, I don't know, if there's parole or something, and this guy gets out of jail with... Still... At just over 60, can he really live with others? I've already discussed cases here where murderers get old, get out of prison, and go back to killing. You must be very careful letting someone like that out on the street. Anyway, Derek, during all this time, in a way, will pay for the crime he committed, the crimes, right? I honestly hope, guys, with all my strength, that he lives every single day in prison. And carrying a burden? Too much for his shoulders, for what he did. I hope he suffers a lot mentally there and is disturbed as well, right? With the memory of Michelle, everything she could have been in life, and that he didn't allow. Because of a desire of sexual climax. Petty, sick, and like that. Unspeakable, right? Let's say? But that's it. What's your opinion on this guy? Do you think he deserved a life sentence, right, guys? The comment section is there for us to exchange ideas. Deal. Thanks for your company. See you next episode.